Okay, so we're going to go ahead and start. We're running a little bit late, but that's all right. Hello, everybody. I want to welcome you and thank you for joining us tonight at the 2019 annual membership meeting of the United Nations Association Monterey Bay Chapter, which I'll now call to order. My name is Lisa Wardinger. I'm the new president of the chapter, following Charles Fuller, who served in that role for the past 4 years, and he's not here tonight. I've been involved with UNA since 2005. My first introduction to it was at the 2004 International Documentary Film Festival, and the humanity, the cultures, and the issues addressed in the films, as well as President Larry Levine's compelling membership pitch, resonated with me. Yes, he's famous for that. So I joined that night. When I ran into Larry shortly afterwards, I said, you know, if there's anything you need me to do, just let me know. So he took me up on that offer. I became secretary for 4 years and went on from there. I was hooked. So that might be an inspiring message or a cautionary tale for you. But either way, here I am, and we're really happy that you're all here tonight. So our UNA Monterey Bay chapter has been active in Monterey County since about 1978, so just over 40 years. We're part of a network of over 200 chapters around the country that share a common purpose to inform and hopefully inspire our community members and policymakers to support the principles, concerns, and programs of the United Nations. You'll be hearing more about the work and challenges of the UN a little bit later on. So, since we're a membership organization, our meeting involves a brief annual report to our members and community as required by our bylaws. We do want to let you know about the good work that's going on in your chapter. After this, we'll move into our speaker presentations. So this is a slide of our 2018 Board of Directors. Our chapter activities are carried out by all UNA members, serving as directors, committee members, and volunteers. Several board members completed their terms at the end of 2018, so we'd like to acknowledge them. 3 of them are actually here. So it's Joe Fulop, Megan Rasmussen, and Satu Tarian, who is our secretary. And you'll see her here with Eleanor Roosevelt at a wonderful UN event. So we'll present our 2019 Board of Directors a little bit later. So we have 5 active committees, as well as special event committees as needed. They're Advocacy, Communications, Film Festival, Membership, and Youth Education. And we'll be talking more about these. We had 4 community events in 2018. These are the programs that we love to do. The annual meeting, the Film Festival, and Human Rights Day are annually held. I'm going to go over each of these in the presentation, but I'm curious, will you raise your hand if you attended any of these events last year? That's great, wonderful, thank you so much. I should mention that at our last year's annual meeting, an extensive chapter bylaws revision was presented and approved. That was one of our points of business. We do have to get business done a little bit during this meeting. So we're going to go into committee reports. I'm going to go in alphabetical order, and I'm going to ask the chair of each committee to raise their hand as we go along. So the first is Advocacy. Larry Levine is the chair. The purpose is, as you can see here, to recommend priority UN-related policy issues and positions to the board, and then to lead the chapter, members, and community in advocating for those positions. And that's primarily to federal decision makers. So in the last year, this was some of the committee work that went on. We have collaborations with several local groups, including Communities for Sustainable Monterey County, and Monterey Peace and Justice Center. They provided advocacy tables at our film festival related to the urgent issues of climate change and peace efforts in Israel and Palestine. And also had a second meeting this year with Congressman Jimmy Panetta to discuss some of the UNA's key UN-related policy issues. In particular, he has a lot of interest in climate change and immigration topics. Our Communications Committee is chaired by Ron Nelson, who isn't here tonight. It was also co-chaired by Megan Rasmussen. And that committee, right, Megan, where are you? Oh, there you are. That committee handles all of our communications to membership and the public, including publicity for events, event notifications, chapter website, and our long-lost chapter newsletter, which hasn't been out for the past year, but hopefully will again. Film Festival. So I was the chair of the Film Fest last year, but really it was a tri-chair position still with Deborah Baker and Mary Fisk, and also a wonderful committee of people that helped with that, including Joe and Ron and Charles Fuller. We estimated really that if there's one institution that our organization has, or our chapter has, it's really the International Documentary Film Festival held each fall. We estimate over 250 films have probably been shown over the past 18 years on a wide range of timely and critical issues. Last year we had about 600 people attend. These were some of the films that we showed. The film festival is offered, attendance for the film festival is free for students, and we have generally about a third of the audiences are students. We had over 100 from Middlebury this last year, so they were well represented. And Middlebury Institute is also a community sponsor of the film festival, so we appreciate them very, very much. There's just a little thank you slide that we showed during our Film Fest. Film Festival takes many months of planning, including raising sponsorships. So our members, some local businesses, schools, and media like KAZU and the Weekly really pitch in and support the festival. And you can see our sponsor board on the back there in the corner. So you'll see the whole list of sponsors there. So membership, we're at about 220 now at the end of 2018. Members are free until age 25. And the important thing about membership, well, there's a few things. One is that the dues are split, membership dues are split between the National UNA office and also our chapter. And having a strong membership really shows the National UNA and shows people in our community that we care about these issues. We care about international issues, climate change, immigration, poverty, human rights, all of those things. So we're stronger with more members. So youth education was co-chaired this year by Jonathan Berkey and Deborah Baker. Jonathan is not here this evening. So the primary focus in 2018 for the youth education team was to support the Model United Nations program for middle and high school students that's organized by the Lyceum of Monterey County, and also to reinvigorate the Youth Education Committee by recruiting faculty members from local high schools to join us. Model UN is a great way to introduce students to the work of the United Nations, and the Lyceum has had a wonderful program for many years that we helped in the initial stages help get going. It was just a photo of our fall event that was at Stevenson School, the Lyceum's fall event. Another one from that fall event. So also in 2018, the Youth Education Committee started their goal to expand and diversify Model UN program events outside of the Monterey Peninsula. So that included outreach to schools like Salinas High School, Seaside High. There was collaboration with the Lyceum to encourage expansion plans to new schools. We supported the Lyceum at the end of the year with a donation of $1,000 for new school recruitment in 2019. We also really enjoy the participation of our high school students in the area on our UNA, the screening and selection committee for the International Documentary Film Festival. We had 2 from Santa Catalina School and 2 from RLS in this last year. And in the spring of 2018, the Youth Education Committee continued its annual Earth Day education series on climate issues, partnering with the UN Club at Middlebury Institute. Speakers focused on the topic of water resource management with climate change. And they had a very good panel there for that. So our final event of the year was Human Rights Day. We've been holding a Human Rights Day luncheon for several decades. It was held on December 8th. December 9th is Human Rights Day, and that's commemorated internationally on that day. 2018 also commemorated the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is just a monumental document that lays out what we all deserve, what human beings deserve to have. And there's another collaboration that happens during that event. We work with the Baha'i Faith on presenting a Human Rights Award, and we had a wonderful recipient, Adriana Melgosa, from Watsonville, from an immigrant defense committee there. A wonderful person, and had a wonderful keynote speaker in Beth Klein, who's a lawyer who's a specialist in human trafficking. And we're happy also to have our 15 local community group co-sponsors at that event. So our proposed 2019 events are International Women's Day, March 8th. That is a confirmed event that'll be happening at Middlebury. It'll be a film and hopefully a panel that'll be happening. International Women's Day is also another event that's commemorated internationally on that day. There's a possible Earth Day event at Middlebury that'll be in April around Earth Day. Possible Community Forum with Representative Jimmy Panetta in April. United Nations Day is always commemorated also around the world, October 24th. We are planning to do our International Documentary Film Festival during that time frame and kind of combine both of those events. And then Human Rights Day luncheon will be December 7th this year. So all of these events need a good team to pull them off and a strong committee behind them. So we really encourage any of you that are interested in seeing successful and interesting events happen in this area on these issues, please ask. Please be part of our organization and our committee work, and let's talk about that. So, we have to do a little bit of chapter business. I need to present 3 things to you. Our 2018 financials. So Joan Condon is our treasurer, and she's thankfully the person that does the number crunching. We do our work with a modest budget. We have no paid staff, nor office. Events like the Film Festival and Human Rights Day generally pay for themselves. The rest of the activities that you've heard about, including any contributions to local youth education work and UN-related agencies, are only possible because of your membership dues and donations. So, comparing our budget for this last year to the actuals, you'll notice that the estimated income was a little lower than expected and expenses were a little bit higher. But generally, in the ballpark. We made up the difference with our reserve fund and ended the year in good shape, balance of $19,329 $0.59. So we did pretty well. 2019 budget was recently approved by the board. You'll note that our expenses are running a little higher than income this year, and we'll make that up out of those reserves that I just mentioned. Our board of directors in 2019, we had an active nominating committee chaired by Mary Fisk, thank you Mary, that developed an excellent slate of new candidates that was approved by the board recently, including Margila Vasic, who's somewhere new. Okay. Phil Cisneros, who couldn't be here tonight, Boyd Haight, our new secretary, and Elaine Herman. Voting for the new directors and officers was then done by e-ballot to membership in November. Since we have over 200 members, our bylaws require only 10% of the membership to approve the new directors. It's a pretty minor number. And so they happily received enough votes. So thanks to all of you who voted. So now I'm happy to present the full slate of UNA Monterey Bay directors to you. And we'd like to ask all of you to stand so you can see. All right. We have a good year ahead. We want to thank you again for being here, and we want to really encourage you to get involved. Join if you're not already a member, renew if you are a member, ask your friends to join and come to our events and get involved. And we really appreciate the support. And that concludes the business part of the meeting. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm going to now introduce Boyd Haight, who is going to come and talk about the United Nations in 2019.
Thanks again, Lisa. It's a pleasure to be here tonight, and I'm really pleased to see so many young people out tonight. And I hope some of you have a chance to come and talk to me afterwards. I joined UNA USA a year ago when my wife and I returned from living overseas for 35 years, working for the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. And I can only be an advocate for the good work that the UN does in the field and among governments, and it depends very much on the active participation of all nationalities, but including Americans. So it's great to be able to be here to talk a bit tonight about the state of the UN in 2019. And what I'd like to do is just take a step back from what Lisa has been talking about what the UN USA does more locally, to look at the UN more globally, and lead into our keynote speaker, who's going to talk about some of the particular work on refugees and migrants. Now, I'm sure many of you know that the UN was established in San Francisco, the signing of the UN Charter, which and the UN has four main purposes: to keep the peace throughout the world, to develop friendly relations among nations, to cooperate, have nations cooperate in solving international problems and promoting respect for human rights. And Lisa mentioned the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and also to be a center for harmonizing the actions of nations. And it's important to remember that what the UN is not a world government. It is a place where nations and people can come together to promote peace and resolve problems. The UN has 193 member states throughout the world. The number has increased from the original signing. I think the original signature on the charter was about 50 nations. 50, and I don't think there's any country left now that's not a member. Potential other than Palestine, which is an observer, and the Vatican, which is an observer. I think all and there's 6 trustee territories. The last thing I remember, but the UN works through its various bodies to maintain international peace and security. One of the big things you hear in the news is about peacekeeping, protecting human rights, delivering humanitarian aid, which is also something very much that you hear about, but more importantly, promoting sustainable development among all countries, and in particular through the recently adopted Sustainable Development Goals, the Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development, and then upholding international law. And it primarily works through a number of mechanisms. The UN General Assembly, which is an assembly of all the member states, which has authority over how the UN Secretariat operates, which the Secretariat being the Secretary General and the staff, I don't know, 30,000, 40,000 staff members of the UN. It also has subsidiary bodies, the Security Council, which is in fact the most powerful body in the UN. It's the body that can make decisions, to take action, to mobilize peacekeeping forces, and to require nations to do things to keep the peace. There's also the Economic and Social Council, which deals more with development activities, the Human Rights Council, which deals with implementing the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the Trusteeship Council, which oversees the remaining 6 territories that are trustees. And then the other main part of the UN is what's called the UN system, which is in fact the 36 UN specialized agencies, funds, and programs. I work for one of the specialized agencies. There are others in the room. Mary Fisk, one of our board members, was working more, I think, in the Secretariat itself. And maybe others of you in the room have worked for the UN, and that's where the work actually gets done. The programs you know about, I'm sure, UNICEF, the UN Children's Emergency Fund, the World Food Program, these are all specialized parts of the UN, and that's how the UN works on the ground and with countries. Now, some of the main achievements of the UN globally in 2018, one, although it may seem far removed, but it's particularly important, is forging a peace between Ethiopia and Eritrea. It's something the UN was actively involved in, 2 countries that have had very difficult conflicts on their border and have signed UN-brokered agreements. Also, progress on peace, although we're still a long way from having peace in Yemen, on the Korean Peninsula and South Sudan. Examples where the UN has had special representatives or rapporteurs working with various parties to try to come to agreements, bringing that back to the Security Council and the Secretary General to try to make progress in making agreements. There was also consensus on implementation of the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. The Paris Agreement, which was agreed originally in 2015, every year has a conference of parties signatory to the agreement on how it will be eventually implemented through the targets, through financing, and the most recent meeting was in Poland in December, where implementation arrangements made a big step forward. There are also, in 2018, 2 global compacts, one on migration and one on refugees, and our keynote speaker will be covering these, which were agreed. And finally, the UN reform of the UN Secretariat and the UN system to make them a bit more efficient and effective. Now, you can follow the UN developments, information, decisions, quite easily on the internet. Very simple to go to un.org, or you can watch live or recorded proceedings of the General Assembly, Security Council, and other bodies at webtv.un.org. And of course the UNA USA website also has a lot of information. Now, just briefly on the global context of which I'm sure you're all familiar that we're now operating in terms of international problems, we have these ongoing conflicts, which we all know about in Afghanistan, Iraq, Myanmar, Nigeria, Syria, Venezuela, Yemen. There are others that are perhaps a little bit below the radar, particularly in Central Africa, Cameroon, Central African Republic and the Congo, where the UN is active with peacekeeping forces or special representatives trying to move forward on bringing or maintaining peace. There are also the growing effects of climate change, which are transboundary in nature, either environmental effects on water or oceans, but also related in part to some of the migration that we're starting to see taking place. And in that respect, there's a high and growing number of refugees and migrants, rising economic and social inequality throughout the world, both among nations and within nations, threats to the rule of law and human rights, disputes over trade, and somewhat of a growing lack of faith in government and also in some countries in the UN. So these are some of the contextual situation that we're looking at now. Now, in terms of the U.S. government policy and actions, I think you could put it into two broad categories. One, in the last 2 years, under the present administration, a real lack of support for multilateral institutions. And for the UN, that means reduced funding, reduced political support, and that can take place not only domestically, but also in our representation at the UN. We've recently, the U.S. ambassador to the UN has left, and there is no ambassador there now. Of course, there are State Department people, but you need to have a high level of representation to really be able to move forward. And more seriously is the withdrawal from international agreements. The intention of the U.S. to withdraw from the Paris Agreement on climate change, that the U.S. did not adhere or did not participate in the finalization of global compacts on migration and refugees, and some that were not within the UN ambit, but still are international, Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement that was not, the U.S. did not participate in. The Iran deal on nuclear weapons, and also most recently the INF, yes, that's what I say, it's the intermediate weapons treaty, which the U.S. has pulled out of. So the context from the U.S. policy point of view is going back in a way, and in this respect is where the UN-USA has an important role in trying to show the importance of the UN and its purposes and how it works. Now, there are 6 main UN priorities that have been put forward and are being worked on by the UN Secretary General and the UN General Assembly President working together. Remember, the Secretary General is simply the appointed head of the UN system, is not a government, is not an elected by people, is elected by the governments. And the General Assembly President has a very important role in terms of guiding where the General Assembly, what it's going to be talking about during the year. So there are 6 main priorities that have been put forward. One is to really use diplomacy and partnerships for peace with support of the Security Council. And this may seem very high level, but it's important for the UN to be able to work more closely with key governments to push forward the work on peace. Also, a much greater ambition on climate change, and there will be a climate summit at the UN General Assembly in September to mobilize action. Every September there's usually a particular theme, and this year will be on climate, which is important because it gets at a very high level with heads of state and government. Also on sustainable development, to accelerate change in countries to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, and that's being supported by the reformed and revitalized UN system. Also, an interesting one, attention to challenges presented by new technologies that aiming to help reduce digital inequality as a force for good. And this is one that is coming in part from what's happened in the global, the big software companies. But the other one, which is a little bit underneath, is the effects of robotics on, eventual effect of robotics on employment and the effects in developing countries. Then the international implementation of the new global agreements on refugees and migrants, which I think the next speaker will be part of his presentation. And finally, reaffirming the UN's value in the world and building greater public understanding. And again, this is the role of an organization like the UNUSA to help to work with our own decision makers, policy makers, and the general public in what the UN does and how it can help everybody. So with that, Lisa, I'll turn it back to you to introduce the next speaker.
So actually, I don't have anything to say other than to introduce Mary Fisk, who is going to introduce our keynote speaker.
I'm very pleased to introduce our keynote speaker of the night. He's an international journalist, and his name is Andrew Purvis. Andrew was born and raised in Montreal. He received a bachelor's degree from Middlebury College and a master's degree from Columbia. After working for several Canadian newspapers, in 1989 he joined Time magazine. And he joined as a medical reporter. I haven't figured that out yet. He was appointed Africa Bureau Chief in 1992 and later served as Bureau Chief in Canada, the Balkans and Eastern Europe, Turkey, and Germany. Andrew presided over Time's coverage of the UN intervention in Somalia, the genocide in Rwanda, terrorist attacks in Europe, and the war in Georgia. He has reported and written extensively on the transition to democracy in Eastern Europe and political Islam in Turkey. His stories on Serbian paramilitaries in the Balkans were cited by war crimes prosecutors in The Hague as part of their case for the genocide against the regime in Belgrade. And his Somalia reporting was cited by Time in a compilation of the best reporting of the past century. After 20 years of working for Time, in 2009, he served as a John S. Knight Fellow at Stanford, developing a prototype website to link editors and writers around the world to enhance foreign news coverage. During the next 5 years, he worked as a senior consultant for UNHCR, who I'm sure many of you have given money to in the past from this group. He produced print, web, and video stories about Syrian refugees. And that's what he's going to talk about to us tonight. The refugee story separating fact from fiction. Please welcome Andrew Purvis.
So, thank you for having me. It's great to be here. My wife and I drove down this evening from snowy Belvedere in Marin County. We were hoping that the weather was better down here. We were, yes. It was? Yeah, so I wanted to just start by saying that I've worked inside and outside the UN, and my work with UNHCR was a shift for me, and I was struck by a couple of things. Mainly the critical role that it plays on the ground in helping and organizing the response to refugee flows, but also the flow of information about refugees and about conditions facing them. And it's a little bit about that I wanted to speak this evening. So my background, I'm a journalist, as Mary said. By training, I was a foreign correspondent for Time magazine for about 20 years. Some of it was conflict reporting, and that's where I first encountered stories about refugees. About 8 years ago, I started working for the UN, for UNHCR, essentially as a media specialist. And I was organizing and managing a group of journalists, video, photographers and writers to produce stories for global media about refugees. It became essentially a Syria beat, and I was based in Beirut for 3 years. And our goal at the time was to, it's hard to imagine now, but our goal was to try to raise awareness about the plight facing Syrian refugees. Now, Syrian refugees are in the news a lot nowadays, probably not exactly in the way that we anticipated. So, my topic this evening was overall the refugee situation and how the story has been told nowadays, and some distortions, some mistakes, and some discouraging trends, but also some good work that's being done. And finally, I wanted to touch on how we, in order to keep our spirits up, how we can help. I'm not progressing with my. This is me, by the way, when I started as a foreign correspondent in Sudan, with more hair. This was in Libya with UNHCR. Okay, so I wanted to say, also as an aside to begin with, that working with refugees for me it struck me. I was first struck by the impact that these stories had compared to many of the other topics that I worked on, in terms of the response from readers, and also in the way in which I felt about them. Essentially, I felt like it was this unexpected privilege to be put in these situations where people are undergoing tremendous hardship and surviving against unbelievable odds. And I was moved by this opportunity and struck by the fortitude and the qualities, the character of people who were surviving under these conditions. So in a way, you see, in this kind of reporting, you see, of course, the worst in human nature because it's conflicts, but you also see the best. So I'm just going to back up a little bit and give some context. The big picture nowadays, I'm sure you guys are, I don't know how familiar you are with the whole refugee migrant question, but there's 68.5 million displaced people in the world today. 25 million of them are refugees, 40 million are internally displaced, and 3 million are asylum seekers. The definition, there's been some discussion about this lately, again because of the political nuance. A refugee, by UNHCR's definition, is someone who's been forced from their home, been forced to cross a border, an international border, and they specifically look at the reason why someone was forced to leave, and it's based on race, nationality, affiliation with a political party or a social group. An IDP, internally displaced person, which is, just to go back to this slide, is actually the bulk of the displaced people in the world. These are people who leave for the same reasons, but they stay within their country. And an asylum seeker, which we've heard a lot about lately, it's actually a relatively small number, but these are people who've, again, left for the same reasons, but they showed up at the border of a third country and asked for asylum based on this question of being persecuted at home. So all these categories share one thing in common, which is they were driven from their home and they have a legitimate fear of going back. And they are all accorded legal protection under international law by signatories of international treaties, especially the 1951 UN Refugee Convention and the 1967 Refugee Protocol, of which the US is also a signatory. So, this is the growth in displacement. This is starting in 2007. So it's up about 50% over the last 10 years or so. And these are the major, this is as of 2017-18, these are the major source countries. So Syria is a big one. One of the big, this is the last statistic I'll inflict on you. This was the most amazing thing when I saw this, because I actually had, as a journalist, no idea that most refugees, and this is still true today, are living in the developing world. They're living still, whatever you might hear from our political leaders, they're living in the neighborhood of the conflicts that drove them from their homes. So in East Africa, in Kenya, and Uganda, or in the Middle East, in Lebanon, and Jordan, and Turkey, and Iraq. Okay, so big numbers. The story of refugees, I'll get to how it's being dealt with today, but generally the numbers have been there for some time, and it's a story that's simmered in the background. Occasionally we would hear about a crisis. For instance, back when I was in Africa, the Rwandan Genocide produced a huge flow of refugees into Zaire, and everyone was suddenly paying attention. While they ignored the genocide, they actually were paying attention to this refugee flow. So there are moments when people paid attention, but generally it's simmered in the background. And then about 4 years ago, something happened, which was this sudden flow of refugees from Syria into Europe. And with that, everything changed. Also about the same time, there was an increase, a sort of notching up in the number of asylum seekers arriving at the US southern border from Central America and from Venezuela. But that number it's important to remember that number is very small. It's even today, this year it's going to be about 300,000, which is less than 1% of the total displaced in the world. Anyways, this arrival in Europe was a huge humanitarian drama, and it produced a political backlash. The generosity of the Germans, mainly, and the Swedes triggered a reaction in other parts of Europe, especially in Eastern Europe, but also within their own political constituencies. And also in the US, unfortunately. And that's where we are today. So, as an observer, and I've been back here for a couple of years, I thought this was quite an interesting evolution, and quite a dramatic evolution. We lived in Vienna, my wife and I lived in Vienna back in the 2000s, and at that time a far-right party emerged under a guy named Jörg Haider. And there was some sort of uncertain links with the Nazi Party, and there was a huge outcry in Europe and in America that the Austrian government would consider taking a party like the Freedom Party into its government, into a coalition, and sanctions were placed on Austria. And we in the U.S., we in Canada, in Brussels, everyone was sort of felt quite proud of themselves and somewhat complacent, smug about the idea that this couldn't, we've nipped this in the bud, and this couldn't happen here. So again, this is an interesting, things have changed. So now about every day, you have barely a day passing without some reference to refugees, asylum seekers, the use of terms like invasion, infestation, criminals and illegal aliens, as if people can be illegal. Of course, the prime perpetrator is the man in the Oval Office, and I don't have any nice large pictures of him. I just have a few of his quotes. I think we've all seen enough. So this is in November 2016. He even actually is trolling other leaders who have taken steps to try to address the refugee flow, which I think is, it's hard to see the value in that. And then we have, it's ongoing, so he's not specifically speaking about refugees here, but the orientation towards these migrants coming and potential refugees coming from Central America is part of the same discourse. And of course, it's not just Donald, but actually his vice president was helped lead the charge against resettlement of Syrian refugees back in 2015, when a series of mostly Republican, I think there was one Democrat, governors said they would not accept any Syrian refugees within their states. And I think we had one other citation, actually, was Jeff Sessions, the former Attorney General, who ordered the Justice Department to use the term illegal alien. They were trying to use a more accurate term, undocumented immigrants, but he ordered them to use legal alien. So this is a part of this Orwellian campaign. And speaking of Orwellian campaigns, this particular network has really helped supercharge the effort to slander a whole group of people. Now, I don't want to limit ourselves to the U.S. because, of course, in Eastern Europe, Hungary in particular, but also Poland, there you see the same language. Germany, we know about the rise of the far-right party there, although again they're not in government, or they're in parliament, but they're not in government. So this is Germany, and Germany, of course, had 1 million Syrian refugees arrive. So it's in any case. So I was, as an observer, I was a little bit taken aback by this. I thought, I kind of got, I'm not going to leave this slide out because it's just so unpleasant. I would understand the European governments responding in this kind of way, given the flow of refugees into that part of the world. But the United States actually has relatively few Syrian refugees. In fact, when I was working in Beirut, in the UN offices in Beirut, I had my next door neighbors were charged with vetting refugees, Syrian refugees, for resettlement around the world. And they knew that the United States, even at that time, and this was under the Obama administration, were chary or were wary of anyone from the Middle East, and they would try to make sure that the candidates that they would put forward after at least a year of vetting to the U.S. were either single mothers or handicapped. They would never ever put a young male, single male, even up for consideration. And in the end, the number of Syrian refugees coming into the country at its peak, so yeah, this slide has it, at its peak was about 12,500, and then it dropped in 2017, in total less than 20,000, so about 18,000 Syrian refugees through resettlement came into the country, which is compared to Germany, where there is nearly 1 million, Canada, which has taken in 50,000, and Lebanon, where I was living and when this was happening, which is a country of 8 million people, took in, at one point there were almost 2 million, so a quarter of the population. I think at this point I'd like to just touch on the main criticism, if that's what it's called, the main accusation that this administration and its supporters has made against Syrian refugees, which is this link to terror. Trump and Pence and the Republican governors, when they were saying that Syrian refugees can't come, all of them cited this possibility of terrorist attacks. And there is no evidence at all for this assertion. There's not a single Syrian refugee who's been convicted of planning a terror attack in the United States. In fact, of all the refugees, not just Syrians, but all the refugees admitted to the US since 2001, there have been just 3 convictions on terror charges, and 2 of those were for plans to carry out an attack outside of the United States. The system of vetting for refugees, again, is rigorous. It's in addition to the UNHCR, which does its own, which looks at the background of each individual put forward for resettlement. A country like the U.S. has in place procedures. In our case, 6 different departments are looking at the background of a refugee before he or she comes to this country, and it usually takes upwards of 2 years. And even, I mean, one of the things that strikes me about this notion that people are using refugees or trying to use the resettlement programs to come and attack America is that if you're a Syrian refugee sitting in Lebanon trying to get out of that situation, which is a nasty one, and I'll touch on it later, you can't choose your country. You can just put yourself forward for resettlement, and then they'll come back to you and say, okay, lucky you, you're going to Saskatoon, or, which is the case of a friend of mine, or you're going to Denmark. And some people have gone through to the US, but they couldn't choose to do that. So, and yet, on this basis of a terror threat, the US government appears to be shutting down not just resettlement for Syrians, but resettlement generally. And this is a program that's gone on since the Vietnam War. The U.S. has been generous over the years. In fact, it's led the way in terms of absolute numbers of people who have been resettled to the country, although on a per capita basis, it's not at the top, but it has played a significant role. The numbers have gone from somewhere around 100,000 a year down to 22,000 last year, which is the lowest. It's actually half of the ceiling that was set by the president. And it's the lowest number in 40 years. And they're specifically singling out Muslims and singling out, or excluding Muslims and excluding Syrians. The total number of Syrians, and this is, remember that Syrians, this is the country, the biggest source of refugees in the world. Total number accepted to the US last year was 62. And a third of those were Christians, which is fine, but Christians are actually a very small minority of Syrians, less than 10%. So, whatever Trump and his supporters might say, the real burden for caring for refugees, I'll just take you back to the 85% number at the beginning. The real burden lies in the developing world, that's being shouldered by countries in the developing world. Uganda, Kenya, Pakistan, Lebanon, Jordan. The only way for a wealthier country to help share that burden, which is part of the global compact on refugees, the only way for us to help share that burden, in addition to providing funding for agencies like UNHCR, is to resettle. And we're not doing that. And I just wanted to say, I lived in Lebanon for 3 years, and there were many refugees there, and the conditions for refugees in those surrounding countries, it's better than within Syria. So they're not actually fearing every day for their life, or they're not being taken off to jail, but their children frequently, and in most cases, can't go to school. The men can't work. They are the subject of harassment, hostility. There's some direct attacks on camps because the Lebanese are fed up, as are the Jordanians, and well, the Turks are a little bit more under the control of the government. But it's a hostile environment. And these folks have, at this stage, nowhere else to go. And the choices for a refugee are, you go home, and you can't go back to Syria right now. You are integrated in the country in which you've landed. So in Lebanon and certainly in the Middle East, they're not welcoming the integration of Syrian refugees for good reason, because it's a huge share of their population, and it's not, these are small countries. Or you're resettled to the third world, or to a third country, and that option is now closing. So, in my opinion, if the U.S. administration, if policymakers wanted to create a program that would destabilize large portions of the developing world, this would be an excellent way to do so. So, where do we go from here? This is it, by the way, this is refugee resettlement over last year. This is what's happened since the advent of this fellow in the White House. So where do we go from here? I have three thoughts on this. The first thing may seem obvious, but tune them out. We don't have to listen to these politicians. We can ignore the hate speech. We can call it out if need be. We have to look for these sort of dog whistle terms like criminal aliens and gang members and infestation and invasion, and note that these statements are made without evidence and devoid of any kind of context. So that's the first thing, and I know it's obvious. Second thing, inform ourselves. On the subject of refugees, the issues don't change radically over time. So while we have conflicts in different places and different numbers, and we have a different kind of response from our governments, if you can go out and do one sort of afternoon of research and look at the questions like, what rights do asylum seekers have in the United States or in your home country? What risks do they pose? How much does welcoming them cost compared to other programs? How does resettlement work? And what are our obligations? So that kind of research, again, a relatively short time spent on that would pay dividends. And it wouldn't depend on the Twitter-driven news cycle, which can make you crazy. Good sources for that kind of information are Wikipedia. That's true. And when you drill down a little bit, if you want to look at a specific case, there are United Nations sites which are particularly helpful. And the UNHCR it takes very seriously its role as a guardian of refugees, as an implementer of the Refugee Convention and a guardian of the safety of refugees. So over the next few months, this question of where the Syrians in Lebanon and Jordan would go is going to come up. There's already been discussion about creating so-called safe areas within Syria. There's a push from a number of fronts, including Assad, but Russia, Lebanon, to push them back to Syria. There's one agency which is which will tell you the truth on this question. You're not going to hear it necessarily from Washington, and that's UNHCR. So that's worth the UNHCR.org is a particularly valuable and trustworthy source of information there. So I'm a journalist, and one must ask, what about news organizations as a source of information on things like this? And I have to say that they're a tricky source of refugee news because they don't have a lot of time or space for the background and context that's necessary in a story. That editors and reporters also prefer conflict, as we all know, and that's not always that doesn't always lead you to the most sensible position on a complicated question like refugee rights. And they tend to focus a lot on the utterances of elected leaders. So you can spend a lot of time repeating what's said in the White House, but it's not going to be illuminating. So Yeah, so okay, that's it. And I just did want to say that refugee story is not a partisan story. It's not a left or right, Democrat or Republican, Canadian or American story. These are human stories. And I was struck by this, actually reminded of that notion just here in California with the coverage of the fires, the Camp Fire in Chico, and seeing these people fleeing with literally nothing but the clothes on their back, as the cliche goes about refugees. Not knowing where they were going the next day, not knowing whether they were going to get any assistance. And it was a reminder for me of the universality of this experience. So I know my own family has refugees in centuries ago. All my grandparents were migrants. So it's a universal experience and it's a human experience. I thought it's similar in some ways to the environment as a topic. I remember when I was working in New York for a time, back in the 1980s, we had the Time has this Man of the Year selection, and we made the Earth the Planet of the Year, which is this great innovation. And of course, there was a response from some folks who said, "Well, how can you do this? You're adopting a left-wing position." And we had a great editor-in-chief at the time named Jason McManus, who was a real wordsmith, and he was a very sensible guy. And he wrote a response to this. He said he acknowledged that yes, we recognize that the environment is a complicated question, but in the end, we are in favor of planet Earth. And I think the same could be said of refugees. So, I'm going to go to a few fun stories here. In addition to informing yourself, is that because it's a human story, the stories of individual refugees is something that really sticks with me. I just discovered on Netflix, on dogs, last week, this great story about a dog named a husky named Zeus. He's like a very sweet dog, whose owner was Syrian and had to leave without Zeus, and ended up in Europe. And it's a story of how his friends smuggled Zeus out of the country and they're reunited. But it's a very heartwarming story, but it's actually a very well told story and very honest about the problems that people face. It's nothing to do with the statistics. When I was in Lebanon, we did a number of stories ourselves. In fact, that's was my job. We did stories, so I'll just touch on a couple of them. This is on child labor, so kids, by and large, weren't able to go to school. So these kids are the oldest one is 14, and they're working in making charcoal in the Bekaa Valley. This is a story about centenarians. So we found this, again, because it's pretty high country, I suppose, a surprising number of very elderly Syrian refugees who were in a way it was a sign of how bad things had become on the other side of the border, that the people of this age were having to get out. These are people who lived through 6 wars, starting with the First World War. So, and here's a story about guys, and this is on the border of Israel, actually, and these are in Lebanon. These are there was a town in Syria which is known for its pigeons. I don't know if whoever has lived in the Middle East knows this practice of raising star pigeons. And this whole town transplanted itself to Lebanon, and they took their birds with them. And they were starting to market them in other parts of the world. So I wanted to close. I have one short video to show you, which is an individual story of someone who we met there. But before I do that, I thought the main thing, if one feels overwhelmed by this this problem is to have a look at what people are doing on the ground and to give. And there are UN agencies on the ground, there are INGOs, international NGOs, or non-governmental organizations, and there are US-based groups, or there are groups here which are helping with the little resettlement that is happening. So I'll just go through those. UNHCR, where I worked, is an umbrella organization that is not only coordinating all the work, but is also providing shelter, some education. The World Food Program is food only and is absolutely critical. UNICEF, as everyone I'm sure knows, is focused on helping children through education and child protection. I actually printed up a sheet of agencies that I mean, it can be a long list, but I tried to pick ones that I thought were doing particularly good work. Now, I work for UNHCR, so you might consider that to be a sort of a bias. Someone asked me, I was giving a talk in Santa Fe, and someone asked me, how about the local NGOs and the smaller groups, which are doing great work. But if you're sitting here in California, it's hard to know who at any one time is actually active in a particular area. And the advantage of giving, if one would like to give to a larger organization, is that they're more flexible. They have operations in different places, so they can respond more immediately to if there's an immediate flow of refugees to Arsal in Lebanon at a particular time, they can divert resources there. So in the end, while there's a slightly higher administrative cost in these larger organizations, that's where I give my money. So my many millions. Okay, so I have as I said, I have a list of these groups, so I can give that out. And I just wanted to close with this, see if it works. This is a story of someone we met in the back.
My name is Hani, and I'm 20 years old, from Homs, Syria, and I left my home because of the war there. I live right now in Lebanon's Al-Baqaa Valley in a small camp with my family. The timing here doesn't matter because we don't do anything, so we don't have repeated actions every day, like the school, like the university. All our life is related with this small camp, so we don't care for the time. We are just living, I don't see my future here. I don't see something. I'm just living all day, every day, the same. Every morning is a battle with myself, It's all the feelings come to me, and all the memories. How I left my home, how I left everything there. So here every morning I feel the same. I want to share my life with the others, Every morning I had to take photos and send it for my friends, and they do the same, so we can feel that we are together. My phone is my little world, Syrian guy, I want to send a message for the world that I'm so proud of myself and so proud of my countries, but please stop all of this for the children. It's not good when you see all of this killing, all of this blood and all of this destruction, and you say, I don't care. You are humans. As a humans, you have to care for us.
So that's it. I just, Hani, by the way, was resettled to Saskatoon. He had no idea. He asked me, is that a nice place? In the summertime? And he's studying he's in an engineering program at Ryerson Polytechnic, which is sort of the MIT of Canada. So he's on his way here. There's one more picture of him. That's him with his little brother, Ashraf. Okay, thank you very much.
But if you have a burning question you would like to ask in front of the group, please raise your hand. We have time for just a couple. Larry.
Thanks for your presentation and for the work you've been doing all these years. I was wondering, it's clear that the United States has taken nowhere near its fair share of refugees, even in the past, let alone in the last couple of years, going down to next to nothing. Have we made up for that by putting in more of our share of funds for supporting refugees in the other countries where they're staying?
Has there been a commensurate increase in funding from the U.S.?
Or have we just recognized that we're not going to take all these people, we're going to help Jordan and Lebanon and these other countries to support their refugee population?
Their U.S. funding has been traditionally generous. The last I heard was that there hasn't been a decrease, but I bet there are people in this room, at least for funding for UNHCR. But there hasn't been an increase to make up for the lack of resettlement.
Yes.
In terms of refugee resettlement, what is your opinion on, I know you spoke briefly about voluntary organizations. What's your opinion on the formal institutions that are in place? Do you think they should be taking more of a stake in the way refugees are processed and resettled in host countries, specifically in Western countries? Or do you think the brunt of the work should still stay locally, local communities, charities, NGOs, and informal institutions that honestly don't always have the necessary resources? There's scarce in funding a lot of the times, and there's a lot on, it makes refugees have to rely on their social network and social support. So what's your opinion on that?
Well, I think the NGOs and the church groups, which are particularly active, not just Christian, but the religious groups that are particularly active in the United States, they're effective. There's fundraising issues, but they are the recipient of federal government dollars, all of them, all the major ones. So I guess from my point of view, that the right people are doing the work. The funding should be channeled through them, and I don't see any advantage in creating a separate federal institution that occupies itself with resettlement. It's such a local issue. I know in Canada, where I'm from, that there's there's a mechanism in which the people residing in an area can pool their resources and help support someone who's coming to that area. But it's not only a useful fundraising mechanism, but it also means there's buy-in from the local community. So the idea of having someone from the outside come, and whatever kind of resources they have coming from the outside and bringing a refugee in, I think is a mistake. I think is a bad idea. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing your experience. In your job as a reporter, have you ever experienced fear on the ground? I guess that maybe the answer is yes. And how did you deal with that?
You mean apart from alcohol and cigarettes? To answer your question seriously, I think when I first, as Mary said, I was a medical reporter actually when I first went to Africa, and I was doing science stories when I got there, and then suddenly this war happened in Somalia, and I was reasonably terrified. I gained an enormous strength, I guess, in retrospect, from my colleagues and from working together with people. So the whole notion as a reporter that you go out on your own, and that's also my inclination, is to go out, try and do things on my own, is something you have to set aside when you're in a conflict situation and you need to share knowledge and share the experience. And I found, for example, when we were in East Africa, people who came in from the outside, Europeans who would parachute in to report on the Rwandan Genocide, for example, had real difficulty with it. And we had some difficulty, but because we were all living there, we're living in Nairobi and talking to each other about it all the time, my colleagues seemed to manage a little bit better than the people who came in and then went back home to the West. So friends, I guess, is the answer.
Where can we find access to your stories? And many of us are interested in the storytelling technique to flip the narrative and to bring it to the personal stories. So what are your recommendations for there are many students here in the room? What are your recommendations again for good resources, and then how to make these resources more to go more viral, for lack of a better term.
Well, the whole notion of how to make a story go viral, that's an interesting one. That's a tricky one. I have no answer to that. Do you remember the Coney? What was it? Coney 2000. Do you remember the whole Coney thing, which went banana? This was a video about a warlord in northern Uganda that just rocked the charts, and everyone came to us when I was living in Beirut, and said, "Why don't we do a Coney? Why don't we just do this thing?" And it's not just a storytelling technique, as you know. It's timing. There are many factors that go into it. In terms of finding videos that you were talking about videos about refugees. Yeah, I can say I have. In fact, it's on my sheet of paper. I have links to. UNHCR has several sites that it's using to try to push out these stories. But nowadays there's actually a bit of a push towards 15-second pieces. So this is this thing is just way too long for the purpose of sharing, even though it's I think it gets the experience more than a 15-second head.
One more question.
Hey, I was wondering, you listed internally displaced and refugees. And the mandate under UNHCR from 1951, at least when I worked for them, we had a real problem dealing with internally displaced. I mean, this is just under international law, right? So I was wondering what changed in that. We never even kept the numbers public. I mean, that was.
Sorry?
We didn't even keep the numbers public of who we'd help internally displaced.
Right.
Because the actual structure of the 1951 and the structure of UNHCR is kind of hands-off on internally displaced along the international law.
That's right.
So I was wondering how that's being handled now, and how you can dealing with one group of refugees in a country that already has such an incredible problem on their own.
Yeah. Well, no, IDPs are now under the UNHCR mandate. It's not in the 1951 convention, but they are under the mandate of UNHCR's care. So these aren't separate.
They don't separate
populations.
them now?
No. They do, I mean, no, they don't. But it's, you know, it's, if you look at IDPs in Syria, for example, there's 5 million of them, 5 or 6 million of them. And Syria's been just an impossible place to access. So in the real world, from a practical standpoint, they're not being taken to as refugees are, as actual refugees are in neighboring countries. But IDPs are within the mandate at this stage.
Yeah, it's places like in Africa that I'm thinking about where you'd be in Malawi, and we have a couple million starving people who His Excellency President Goliath Banda was holding down.
Right.
You know, we had a whole bunch of refugees from next door.
Well, I know in Syria, UNHCR was working with the Syrian Arab Red Crescent, which was close to the Assad regime. So that's the only way to, they're trying to set aside the politics in order to get aid to the people who need it.
So how many times did you have to lie or hold back information from the press to help refugees? I do it all the time. This is not, you're not a journalist, you're working for UNHCR, you're a public information officer.
Yeah.
Did you do that often? I mean,
No, actually, I was
not a journalist.
I was there. I was producing media, so I wasn't a. You're right. There is that PI position, but I wasn't a PI officer. So, or if you're asking whether spokespeople, mislead journalists, that's
I think we want to honor your time and our closing here when we said that we would be dismissing, so we can continue some of these conversations and maybe informally some questions afterwards. We want to thank our speakers so much. And again, thanks to you all. Looking at your faces, standing here looking at your faces, I can tell from the spirit in the room that you are people of conscience, and we thank you for being here tonight, being active members. We didn't have time to talk more about how we can take this message and be as effective as we can as a chapter of the UNA, but we need all of your help in whatever kind of capacity that you can offer. So I've got some sign-up sheets that I'm going to put on the table on your way out. If you feel drawn to join us in any kind of capacity, you don't have to be a board member, but just be a committee member. We'll contact you and tell you how you can help. Everything that we do, these leaders here that are on the board and the activities we're trying to do, are trying to give visibility to these issues, whether it's finding films about refugees at our film festival, having our young people discuss these issues at Model UN conferences, or having our advocacy committee that Larry's working with has just chosen the refugee issues, migrant issues as one of our 3 main areas of focus in the coming year. So if you want to join us in any way, please sign up on your way out. The trash can is over there for helping to clean up. And I want to especially also thank Lisa, who put this whole event together, basically on her own.